So reports came out this week that President Obama is now considering bombing the Syrian government again. It was about 2 years ago that he came out and did a speech and spoke about how Assad is a terrible, brutal, evil dictator and he's using chemical weapons against his own people. So we're going to have to take him out because there's a humanitarian crisis going on. Now, if you remember, he slowly but surely backed away from that for a variety of reasons. Probably one of the most important reasons is that his general said, dude, you can't do it. And another one of the main reasons they gave is there's actually evidence that the chemical weapons was used by the rebels. So the rebels were using it, who were the people you want to side with, and it wasn't the Assad regime. And then furthermore, remember that moment that John Kerry had with Russia in the press conference where they're talking about how basically action against the Assad government is imminent, and then the Russians say, well, is there anything they could do to avoid that? And Kerry said, yeah, well, if they turn over all their chemical weapons, but that's not going to happen. And then the next day, Assad was like, take all my chemical weapons. I don't care. Have them all. Take them all. Don't care. And Kerry was like, fuck. Because he, for the longest time, had wanted to do, regime change against the Syrian government. But again, there's been a lot of confusion in the deep state as to how to deal with Syria. I mean, one of the important stories that we covered a while ago was that we have Pentagon-armed rebels fighting CIA-armed rebels, or I should just say Pentagon-backed forces fighting CIA-backed forces in Syria. I mean, think about that. We're arming both sides. That's like the definition of a conundrum and a quagmire, and it shows you don't know what you're doing. There's the famous story of General Petraeus floating the idea that we should on purpose arm al-Qaeda because al-Qaeda will fight ISIS, who is worse, and they'll also fight Assad. And we don't like either one of them, so okay, let's arm al-Qaeda, the people who fucking attacked us on 9/11. And by the way, it's not like there's historical precedent for how disastrous that would be. It's not like, Ronald Reagan, for example, armed the Mujahideen to fight the Soviet Union, and then, that came back to bite us in the ass. That's right, that's exactly what happened. And every time we do this, we arm the wrong characters, and as a result, it comes back to hurt us. We make our own bed, and then we sleep in it time and time and time and time again. So for a while, they backed off the idea of doing all-out, regime change in Syria and bombing the Assad government. But recently, talks fell apart with Russia. There were peace talks, fell apart for a variety of reasons. The U.S. had accidentally bombed Syrian troops, killing a bunch of them. And then there was, retaliation on the Russian side and the Syrian side, even though to this day they say, look, we didn't do that when it was bombing of whether it was a hospital or forces backed by the U.S., So the peace talks fell apart, and now the U.S. and the Obama administration, they're openly thinking like, well, maybe we take out Assad. And they're ramping up the same kind of rhetoric of, we have to do it. One side is pure good, the rebels. The other side is pure evil, the Assad government. We have to take them out. Look, they're forcing our hand. They're so bad that they're forcing our hand. So understand a large piece of the puzzle that they don't discuss whenever they lean into maybe bombing again and taking out the Syrian government is look at the rebels. The majority of the rebels at this point are Islamists and jihadists. Maybe there was a time a while ago when it was the FSA and the Free Syrian Army was made up of normal people. Maybe there was a brief window there. But it turns out that when you are engaged in war for years on end, all the moderates seem to say, fuck this shit, I'm out. And they flee to Turkey, and they flee to Europe, and they go elsewhere. But, the people who remain are who? The extremists. The people who are Islamic fundamentalists in this case. So one of the biggest fighting forces is al-Nusra. Al-Nusra was officially the al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria. And then to do a little PR rebrand, they looked around, they're like, is anybody paying attention? Anywho, we break up with al-Qaeda, so now we're moderate. Give us weapons and give us money, U.S. Thank you very much. And remember, the rebels are backed by Turkey, the Erdogan government, very fundamentalist, backed by Saudi Arabia, the most fundamentalist on the planet. So how do you think they're going to act? What do you think they're going to do? Topple the Assad government and say, okay, let's have a constitutional republic and a representative democracy. Let's have a secular government and let's protect women's rights and care about gays. No, ask them. They'll tell you. They say, yeah, we want an Islamic theocracy. Duh. Okay. And again, the Obama government is now thinking again, let's bomb in there. Let's go and take out the Assad government. Now, at the same time that's happening, when they're saying, for humanitarian reasons, we may have to act against the Syrian government. They're forcing our hand. What are we going to do? There's so much human suffering there. And one side is pure good and one side is pure bad. We have to do it. While that's going on, take a look at what's happening in Yemen. So Reuters explains here, with food ships finding it hard to get into Yemen's ports due to a virtual blockade by the Saudi-led coalition that has backed the government during an 18-month civil war, over half the country's 28 million people already do not have enough to eat, according to the United Nations. Guys, it appears, based on the pictures and based on the evidence, we're on the verge of, if not already in, a famine in Yemen. The United States, the West, Saudi Arabia. We went in there, we said, how about we just freeze up all your credit, freeze your accounts, and let the population starve. Now, why are they doing this? Because there was a Sunni government backed by Saudi Arabia in Yemen. Then you had Shia Houthi rebels topple that government a while ago. And then they said, oh, that's what you're going to do? Well, that's nice. Now we're going to crack down on the entire population of Yemen. Certainly the entire Shia population of Yemen. And you're going to have women and children starving. The bombing campaign has been insanely brutal. We've discussed the facts on that. Over 50% of the people being killed are civilians. They're just civilians. So they've bombed a potato chip factory, stay classy. They've bombed mosques. They've bombed hospitals and schools for the blind. Guys, they're doing it on purpose. And also, they're using illegal weapons under international law. They've used some chemical weapons. Funny how the U.S. is not concerned about chemical weapons when it's Saudi Arabia doing it. But if it's allegedly, maybe not, the Syrian government doing it, oh my God, we need to act now. Why don't you want to act against Saudi Arabia when we know they've used white phosphorus, for example? We know they're using cluster bombs. You know what cluster bombs do, right? So they'll, bury in the ground when you bomb and they don't explode up front. I mean, this was the problem in, Laos or Cambodia, where you have, all these unexploded munitions in the ground, and the civilian will be walking to pick some fruit or some shit, and boom, they blow up and they're dead. So the problem with this and why it's illegal under international law is that long after you're done bombing, it has effects and it can kill people. But this is what Saudi Arabia is using, and the U.S. the entire time is like, not only are they doing that, not only are they looking in the other direction, they're actively helping them. We just armed them over $1 billion worth. We fucking arm them. We know what they're going to use the weapons for. Guys, we're even part of the bombing campaign. We're even part of the campaign. So look at the contrast. They say in Syria, humanitarian reasons, altruism, we got to be the world police. We got to step in for the people and topple the Syrian government. But in Yemen, where civil war my ass cheeks. That ain't no damn civil war. You have Saudi Arabia, Qatar, virtually every Gulf state, every rich Sunni powerhouse in the United States lined up against Shia Houthi rebels and just bombing civilians to smithereens. In that situation, they got nothing to say. In fact, they actively help in the humanitarian crisis. They aid in furthering the humanitarian crisis. If the U.S. really cared about human rights and cared about altruism and doing the right thing, wouldn't you be rushing emergency food into Yemen as opposed to freezing the accounts and stopping them from getting food and letting Saudi Arabia do a blockade? That's exactly what you'd be doing. Wouldn't you cut off the flow of weapons to Saudi Arabia and sanction them over their actions? That's exactly what you'd be doing. But you're not doing it. You're not, because it's not about human rights. It's not about altruism. It's not about doing the right thing. It's about keeping the order. If you're our ally and you do it, you can do whatever the fuck you want, and we'll say it's moral. If you're not our ally, well, then you're in trouble and we might have to do regime change. And also, let me just say as a final point here, I find it hilarious that many people on the left who say rightly today, you know what, intervention in Iraq was a disaster. Intervention in Libya was a disaster. I mean, sure, Saddam was brutal. Gaddafi was brutal. Nobody's saying they're good. We fucking hate them. We despise them. But that doesn't mean the U.S. should have intervened and toppled the government. That indeed made it worse. It made it worse. Everybody on the left acknowledges that today and talks about that today. But somehow, all of a sudden with Syria, they want to do intervention again. Have you learned nothing about history? Again, recent history. This just happened. All of a sudden, boom, out of the mind. No, Syria's different for reasons X, Y, and Z, and blah, 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 blah. Yeah, you know what? You're right. It is different. Because if you topple there, it'll definitely be worse. Why? As bad as Assad is, we know who's going to fill that vacuum. We know Syria is going to become Al-Qaeda-stan. We know it's going to happen. We know it's going to happen. But the reason why we want him out is Assad, of course, is aligned with Russia, our enemy who we're escalating with, and Iran, our enemy who recently now we're escalating with again. We'd rather have a Wahhabi fundamentalist government in there as long as they're our ally than a less fundamentalist, less brutal government if they're allied with Russia and if they're allied with Iran. So this is what it's really about. It's about geopolitics. It's about business as usual. It's about keeping the world order as it is. It's got nothing to do with a humanitarian crisis, nothing to do with altruism, because if that was the case, not only would you put Yemen higher on the list of priorities, because that really is less of a civil war and more of just a fucking one side is walloping the other side and massacring civilians. You also might put, for example, South Sudan higher on the list of humanitarian concerns, the Congo higher on the list of humanitarian concerns, places where, you have a crackdown where it is more of just a flat-out targeting of civilians than it is a civil war. But no, don't even talk about South Sudan. Who are you kidding? Congo, forget that. Yemen, forget that. Syria, on the other hand, maybe we de facto align with the Islamists and the jihadists because it's geopolitically useful. And as we do it, we say we care about human rights. Just floating the idea.